Now we'll talk about payment classification and U.S. taxpayer identification numbers. Kate's going to talk to the payment classification side, and I'll cover the U.S. taxpayer IDs.
So this sort of starts us out when you're thinking of the tools that Ned showed you. Step one is that high level reportable, not reportable. In order to figure that out, you're going to look at the payment classification. So what type of payment, where does it fall in the 6 circles that Ned has in the chart down below? So when looking at this, it's the activity that's going to drive this payment class, not what the payment is called. And we see this a lot where an award document may say, that a stipend is to be paid to an employee, and logically people may say, oh, it's a stipend in the award, we're going to call it a participant stipend, classification done. Well, it doesn't really work that way. You need to look deeper into what kind of activity is being done for that stipend. Because really a stipend is what we earn every day. It's a wage payment. It's a payment to a person. So we certainly want to really delve deeper into that. And then, the easiest may be service versus non-service classification. So once you kind of know if there's services required, you can look to independent contractor or employee. If it's non-services, then you're going to go down the list and see whether it falls into a fellow, participant stipend, rent, or royalty. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So for an employee, just at a high level to talk about these, there's an employee-employer relationship, which means the RF controls how and when those services are performed. We're going to look at sort of the IRS categories of evidence that they would look at. So is there financial control, meaning whether I am here, I'm working my hours, I get paid for that. I know what I'm going to get paid. I'm sort of guaranteed to get that based on my schedule. Is there behavioral control, meaning we're saying how and when they do the work, the schedule that they need to be at work, and the types of activities that they would be doing while they're there. That's controlled. And then certainly we provide benefits to employees such as retirement, health insurance, and so forth, time off. Independent contractors, they're self-employed or sole proprietors. We may control the outcome, so we may say we want a product at the end of this, a report or something like that, but we're not going to tell them when to do it, where to do it, how to do it. And there could be a risk that an independent contractor makes an estimate on a project and ends up losing money because it takes them longer hours than they thought, or they make out because it takes them less hours than they thought. For non-service payment classifications, we have to start fellowship and participant stipends, and this is always a good discussion. And we do have a document out there on the web that kind of walks us through fellowship or participant stipend table. At a high level and generally, fellowships are payments in support of academic study or fellow-initiated research. These are typically given by a sponsor directly to a recipient, and the RF is the conduit for that money to get to them. So in theory, if a fellowship recipient were to go to another institution, they would take that fellowship with them, is one way you'd look at that. And it is in support of research at a higher ed university. Participant stipends, or honestly, I prefer participant support. It's really a payment for a non-academic or a vocational secondary school education training program or event, and more for participating in that event. So a very simple participant support example would be a secondary school science teacher comes to participate in a workshop at a higher education institution to learn how to teach science to their students so they're college ready to take the courses coming up. And they get a small participant stipend to do that.
We also have two other non-service, as you saw the diagram, royalties and rent. Not every location has that activity. There's a few locations that have a lot of that activity. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but a royalty is tied typically to a negotiated agreement for such things as industrial or copyright royalties. Rents are based upon the use or occupying of property. typically 1099 reportable if it's a U.S. citizen. We're going to get into all that. Next, we wanted to talk about the key risks to the payment classification. This is an area where it's really, really important because typically you hear about it all the time, misclassification. Someone who is an independent contractor thought they were an employee. The key is the difference employee versus independent contractor and getting it right up front. The risk tied to that is basically back taxes. It's usually an independent contractor that should have been an employee. Well, that means the government expected that withholding should have happened and paid to them. And it's funny how they think, oh, well, you didn't pay it to me when it was supposed to be withheld, so therefore it's also late. Penalties on top of that. It wasn't reported right. It's just a stack and a snowball of problems if you have that classification incorrect. Fellowships, participant stipends are a little less risky, but still it gets back to the reporting and penalties that can be put on that. We do hear about fellowships versus employees where people question it. They're really two different things where fellowships are awards, employment is services, but one of the things that kind of spurs that sometimes is the IRS publications will have a lot of language that will talk about the fellowship that provides services. We at the Research Foundation just separate the two from the beginning. We say a fellowship is a fellowship and you treat that as an assignment in the payroll system, and an employee is an employee, treat that as an assignment. So there are people who are on the system as employees and fellows, two separate assignments, and we treat that separately in reporting.
Mm-hmm. And there may be examples, a time when a fellowship does have a small portion that is requiring teaching a lecture, for example. If there is any service that we would look at that's kind of core to our business, or where we would see they're providing a service to the Research Foundation, that would be carved out and paid as an employee. And just to kind of jump in even more on the independent contractor and employee situation, we're seeing more unemployment claims. We've had a few of them from independent contractors. And it may not be that they're misclassified up front, but we have the burden of proof, as Ned mentioned up front. IRS looks at everything as taxable. They're going to look at all compensation as wages. So we need to show and document and prove that it isn't.
And to understand the critical part of that is when they do an audit and they find certain, let's say, populations, the government, IRS, whoever, will then expound and just look at your total volume and just extrapolate it. So it just becomes this huge penalty or fine number. Mm-hmm. So payment classification, as we're saying through here, is just a huge cornerstone to accurate payment, tax, and reporting.
Yeah, and the documentation, as Mike talked about earlier, using these tools is key. You've heard it in other Learning Tuesdays that we've talked about with the payments, and it's document, 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 the 3 Ds. So, not sure. Incorrect payment class does open the project and corporation to risk, as we've talked about, which can be significant to administrators and the payment recipient. We all want this to be right so that we as administrators don't have to go back to the recipient of the payment and say, oh, there's a correction that needs to happen, which may cause them to receive less money if there are taxes involved, because the project budget is limited, as we all know. So contact the appropriate RF office. If you are a PI watching out there, you'd want to go to your campus RF office that handles these types of things, whether that's sponsored programs or HR, or the office that administers RF work. And if you're an administrator watching, I think you probably know Ned's number by now. I have it on speed dial, and my number as well. We're always here to help you with these classification issues, which they can be complicated, we know.
Next, we wanted to move on. Even though we kind of finished up on payment classification, there's always one type of payment classification, because it does have reporting tied to it, that comes up, and that's human subjects. One of the things with human subjects is we would like to see the best practices made of utilizing our system, such as our AP system, which makes the payment, can look at the thresholds on when certain things are paid. But we do know that at times we have flexibility on different ways to pay human subjects. So confidentiality is typically the reason for that flexibility in ways to pay. One of the assumptions is that human subject's always going to receive a 1099, and 1099s have thresholds. So most projects will think, oh, well, they'll never reach that $600 threshold, so therefore it's not a big issue. So that way we don't have any reporting impact. The caution here, as you see my little red box there, is that that's for U.S. citizens, resident aliens, and we're going to talk more about that. If it's a non-resident alien, the general taxation rule is 30%. So there is an impact there. And sometimes this human subject payment is so small that by the time you take that 30%, it's kind of a real blow. So tax and reporting, it's a kind of an issue to be careful of on human subjects. This page of the presentation is purely more of a help to what's happened in some language with the IRS. In 2007, the IRS realized that many organizations were coding or setting up and paying and reporting human subjects as a Box 9, which is for 1099 Box 9, which is for independent contractor. That can have some huge impacts to the individual when they actually go to file their income tax returns. So they realized that many, and many were asking, they realized that many of these human subjects situations are for medical research. So at that time, back in 2007, they came out with an opinion, which then turned into something that's now on the instructions to the 1099 miscellaneous form, that if it is for medical research, to code it under our box, or under the 1099 Box 3. So in the AP system, you'd be processing it and at the invoice level making sure that it has the MISC3 code. That's language for our administrators out there. If you're a payment recipient, the idea is that Box 3 is a lot better for you than Box 7, because Box 7, the IRS thinks you're a self-employed person, you're going to deal with self-employed taxes. So Box 3 is actually called other income.